What is up, everybody? We're back. Corey Hughes' Bloody History. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to start to take some of these exit reps from Kerry Thornley's testimony, and we're going to start to look at some of these people surrounding Kerry Thornley. And one of the names that's very predominant in Garrison's research and Weisberg's research is Philip Boatwright. Philip Boatwright, obviously, to me, this is my interpretation thus far. Although I'll admit the vast majority of education on Philip Boatwright we are going to gain together. Philip Boatwright didn't come up as someone relevant directly connected to the assassination, but they are definitely directly connected to Kerry Thornley. And if I'm not mistaken, Kerry Thornley had given some indications that Philip Boatwright had been connected to some of these same people, like Clint Bolton. Who's obviously going to be a CIA handler at some point. We haven't even gotten to him yet. We will. But this is a transcript of an interview done by Harold Weisberg and Philip Boatwright. And so it's about 62 pages. It'll take 2 or 3 days for us to get through this. But this to me feels like kind of pioneer territory in as far as my research and what will go into future research and future books, right? So this is when I initially started this podcast, I was covering a lot of stuff that I already know, right? Stuff that's already covered in my book, right? But that we haven't even covered here yet. There's a slew of stuff we haven't covered here on the show that I've covered in my book. But we're starting to get into stuff that's not anywhere. Nowhere, none of my research covers Philip Boatwright, right? So other than the incidental occurrences of him and Kerry Thornley's testimony in Garrison's files, Philip Boatwright to me is an interesting character because he's probably another one of these low-level CIA recruits who was paired up with Kerry Thornley down in New Orleans, and they stayed in contact once he got moved out somewhere else. But hopefully we will learn everything that we need to know about Mr. Boatwright over the next couple days. I was going to do the Philip Geraci stuff today, but Jesus Christ. Jesus, that shit, man, there's so much of it. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages on Philip Geraci, and I don't even know what the fuck the deal is with this guy. He's a gay guy from New Orleans, and he got arrested, and there was a raid at a party he was having, and a whole shitload of people got arrested. And I think that's the core of the Philip Geraci stuff, is that people were arrested who were directly connected to Thornley and his crew, and allegedly Lee Harvey Oswald, right? So remember, we're still iffy on the relationships of Oswald in New Orleans. Because half of them were probably fucking Kerry Thornley, right? So we don't know. One thing I never thought of, that I did think of today, is that is it possible that some of the Oswald sightings when Oswald was seen with Kerry Thornley was actually William Seymour? Is that possible? Could Kerry Thornley and William Seymour have been doing things together in New Orleans? It's one of those things that doesn't affect the outcome, but it would, it's definitely an interesting tidbit to add to the equation. So, all right, let's begin on this. This is a cover sheet. It's a letter from Philip Boatwright to Harold Weisberg to preface the transcript. Dear Harold, here's the transcript. I've made all additions, corrections, etc. in red, so you shouldn't have to spend a whole lot of time picking them up. My God, how many of these bloody things have you had to read? This is the dreariest, I don't know what that means, MS period, I've ever put my eye to. I think you wasted your valuable time with it, my friend, and I'm sorry I wasn't more helpful, but in any case, I've added a few clarifying, I hope, comments and made some corrections. Also note page 61 attached to the typescript. Listen, when you return this transcript, why don't you simply add a note saying the typescript is a full and accurate transcript of the interview, sign it, and then not bother about trying to make me a copy of the tape itself. The transcript is enough, Harold. Neither do you have to send me copies of the original materials I've sent you. I have your word that these materials will be returned to me as soon as you and Mr. Garrison are finished with them, and your word is good enough for me. I do want them back, except for the things I said you needn't return paragraph 4 of my letter of the April 21st last, But it is not necessary for you to go through the trouble of making copies and sending them to me in the interim. Keep the stuff as long as necessary. See that it is returned to me when you're done, okay? Incidentally, all the things I loaned you when you were in Omaha to see me have been returned by Mr. Garrison's office, with two exceptions. The Courtney's two books, America's Unelected Rulers and the Case of General Edwin A. Walker. I'd like them back, but as I say, keep them as long as you need to. Another thing you've mentioned is cost, and then something I can't read. Take to mean what I've spent on postage, etc. Well, don't worry about it. You're a writer doing research. I'm a writer too, and I will help you in any reasonable way I can. You see, sir, I've now read the books you were kind enough to leave with me, and I am greatly impressed by the integrity of your work. Good wishes, Philip Boatwright. P.S. Here is a copy of the March 67 Innovator, found among a pile of other unrelated papers when I moved out of the Harney Street apartment. And this is the beginning of the transcript. Transcript of interview with Philip Boatwright. Go ahead. I, Philip Boatwright of Omaha, Nebraska. April 3rd? Yes, April 3rd, 1968. Harold Weisberg is interviewing Mr. Boatwright. I was in New Orleans briefly in certain months from mid-1962 until early January of 63. During that time, I lived in the French Quarter. I just need to preface this also by saying that Philip Boatwright went from New Orleans to Omaha, Nebraska. Who else went from New Orleans to Omaha, Nebraska? Thomas Beckham. Okay. Who else? Fred Lee Chrisman. Right? And possibly David Christ, who we'll get to maybe one day, years from now, down the fucking line, because he's kind of irrelevant. So, but all those guys went from fucking New Orleans to Omaha. Why? Why'd they do that? Because they're fucking low-level CIA schmucks. What was your address, Mr. Boatwright? In the French Quarter? Yes, your address. St. Peter Street. Just a moment. Your address was 935 St. Peter Street. That's right. Let me stop this a minute. And you also lived at 920 Royal Street. Yes, when we first went to New Orleans. That would be in July of 62. July of 62. Oh, yes, 62. Yes, that's right. Because I left. Do you remember who owned these two buildings? The one on Royal Street was rented from the Gandolfo Agency. Yes, a real estate agency there. Who may have owned it, I don't know, but they represented the St. Peter's Street building was owned by a S.B. Udall, or Udell, or UDELL, whose address was in 1963, 6245 Wadsworth Drive, New Orleans. He wrote me in January of 19. This post is in January of 63, relative to some furnishings that had been left in the apartment. And I've forgotten what the agreement was now, but he got a little bit upset about it. Apparently there was some misunderstanding about some of the things were sold and some things were returned. In any case, that's the fellow who owned the building. And so far as I know at that time, he's the person whom we paid rent. Yes, do you remember the owner of the other building or who managed either one? The Gandolfo Agency managed it, the one on Royal Street, but not the other. You don't know about the other one. You don't recall? So as far as I know, Udell took care of that thing himself. In either of these places, did you see a young woman whose picture you may have seen since in the paper? No. Are you familiar with the young woman Garrison tried to subpoena and she left the state to avoid subpoena, whose name came up in testimony of Perry Russo? No, I don't. Okay. I might say her name is Sandra Moffat. Sandra Moffat. Well, you were up there then. I thought it may have appeared in the papers here. Well, it may have. I might say at this time. I'm not. I don't follow the newspapers closely. Sandra Moffat and Perry Russo will do a whole bunch of shows on. Good stuff in there. Sandra Moffat's connected to some people that's like makes you scratch your head. Even though she seems like typical white trash. Really fucking weird who the CIA chose to recruit. Did you ever know Perry Russo, by the way? Not to my knowledge, no. You are and have been for the most of your life a writer, and you do other things for an income from time to time. Is that correct? Yes, I'm fairly widely published as a poet, but I am not what you would call a writer in the sense that I have my income from that. Yes, your employment in New Orleans was writing in one form or another. Yes. Yes, the only employment in New Orleans I had to do was, in fact, most of with Kent Courtney, journalism, newspaper journalism. Yes, the Independent American. And did you have what did you have to do with that promotional work? Yes, for the newspapers. And when did you enter that employment? Soon after you got to New Orleans in July of 62? I'm just trying to pick the dates that you worked for Courtney. Yeah, I wish I knew. I think it was August or September. I didn't work there terribly long. Of course, I wasn't in New Orleans terribly long. Yes, but of 62, and about when do you think you left his employment? Well, I would say October. And there's a bunch of shit here I can't really read. It says dates have been more positively ascertained since this interview. Okay. Same year. Yes. And you also did some promotional work for him in that time, didn't you? Yes. Regular promotional literature. Right. Did Kerry Thornley work for or with Mr. Courtney during that period of time? No. Did he afterwards, that you know of? Not to my knowledge. You've never heard anything about this one way or the other? No. You know of his doing any ghostwriting for Mr. Courtney? No, at the time I knew Kerry, he was working as a busboy at the hotel. Can you place the first time you knew him? I've been trying to figure out how I met him. At the Royal Orleans? Okay, let me just stop right here. There's a theme that you'll see with these fucking CIA guys. They have such selective memory. They just can't seem to possibly remember. I don't know. I might have been there in August or I might have been there in September, but it might have been October. Like, how the fuck do you not remember when you worked at a certain place? I could tell you the exact fucking dates of when I worked at Godfather's Pizza in 1995 in fucking Mesa, Arizona. Okay? I could tell you the fucking dates that I worked at every job I ever fucking had in my whole life. How the fuck can these people not remember anything, narrow it down to like months or even years at times? Because they're fucking liars. They're liars. This is anti-interrogation training with the I can't remember shit. He's asking where he met him. Did he meet at the Royal Orleans? I would not have been apt to have met him there. I probably met him someplace I went frequently, the Bourbon House. You could very well have met him there because he haunted it. Well, most people did. I mean, in the immediate area there. Yes. I'm not sure about this, but I think Brandy met him first, and she introduced him to me. Brandy is Barbara? That's right. Barbara Carey. Yes. Did you ever know Thornley to do any actual writing? You mean published writing? Either published writing or anything more than the one manuscript he seemed perpetually to be working on, The Idle Warriors. Yes, I saw a manuscript, some manuscript poetry, but that's all. What kind of poetry was it? In my view, it was very didactic verse, which did not appeal to me. It was a type of which is fairly frequently published these days, but technically it wasn't too bad. Was he fairly regularly employed when you knew him? So far as I knew, he was employed as a busboy at the hotel during all the time I knew him. Right, which is not terribly long, but yes, he was there all the time. Did you ever see him at Courtney's place, or with Courtney? Did you ever see him with people who you connected with Courtney's operations, either by having seen them there or by having known about it? No, but you mustn't err into, what does this say? Tell you something you already know. I don't want to tell you something you already know. I want to tell you something about Courtney, of course. Now, first of all, he was down on Zimple Street. Yes, Zimple, that's right. He had more than one address. Green Street was one of them. I'll give you an example of the sort of thing I mean, that you never know when you start something what you can find or what it can possibly mean. A part of the story of Oswald in New Orleans is the finding of some handbills that were printed at the Jones Printing Company on Girard Street on Pine Street. The New Orleans police made a big thing out of how close this was to the residence of a Professor Reisman, who believed in peace, and therefore they thought he was a communist. Now, you know the strange thing, it was just this close to Courtney's address on Zimple Street. I went there, and you could walk from one place to another holding your breath. That's how close Courtney and Reisman lived to each other. Maybe it's Reisman. Well, Courtney had an address on Pine Street. What happened to that building? I don't know. I don't believe I was ever there. Was it a building or an empty lot when you were there? That I couldn't tell you. Do you remember there was an empty lot as you looked toward Courtney's home on Zimple Street facing Pine Street? Is it to your left? And if you go down Pine Street to your right, butting up against the back end of Courtney's property is a lot. I believe the address is 1018. Was there an empty lot there that you can remember? Well, the address I have here is 1018 Pine Street. That's for Courtney. And then 7819 Green Street. No Zimple Street? No, but I think that is I'm sure there was a Zimple Street address. I don't have it. Yes, his home is there, and there was, yes, that's right, his home is Zimple Street. The Independent American is either on Pine Street or Green Street. I have Pelican Printing Company, 7819 Green Street. Now, there was a shed behind Courtney's home on Zimple Street in which he also worked, was there not? That I don't know, but I do know you visited his home? Yeah, once. On the ground as you face the home, there was a shed in the back of it. It is a rather good-sized shed, rather good-looking. Maybe shed is the wrong word. It's a decent-looking building. It's a small one. Okay. I do have, while you're looking at in your address book, would you see if you have an address for Carrie Thornley? Well, yes, I have. Let me tell you so, because I don't like to slip up and blindside people. You also know that other people of interest, Barbara may not have told you. She mentioned some artist type that I did not know about at the time. Yes, other people, and we'll come to them in the course of this discussion. That's why the address, I'm very happy you have this address for him. I have 2 addresses for Thornley. One is crossed out. That's just as good as any other. But the other one, 717 Barracks Street. Yes, and the other one, 726 Dumaine. Right. I knew about the Dumaine Street address. This is the address I believe I visited. I believe I was in his place once. He went to he's clarifying in notes, he went to the barracks address. Did you ever know Thornley to live near Dauphine and Esplanade? Now, wait a minute. Esplanade is Barrack Street. The first one from Esplanade, I was going to say that's close to it. Yes. Now, Barbara told me about a friend whose name she couldn't remember, and people in New Orleans are undoubtedly getting that name now. An art professor at Tulane. You remember him and his wife. Do you remember where they live? I'll tell you what I've done. I've asked Mr. Garrison's office to have a photographer take some pictures of that area, hoping it will refresh her recollection and yours. By the way, I may ask you this, a set of pictures of people, some of whom are involved and some not. They're all mixed up, Mr. Boatwright, so you won't be given one kind, you know. Would you, if I were to mail those to you, or if Mr. Garrison were to mail those to you with no identification at all, but just say numbers, would you mind going over them, and if you recognize any of them, writing a brief as you have afterwards? Yes, these are people she was talking about. Yes, these are people she was talking about. They live by Fred's, and that's his wife, Beverly. Beverly Basler. Yes, Basler. 1031 Orleans. Right. They had an apartment upstairs. Can you see the 1300 block of Dauphine Street from there? Gosh, well, let's see. Orleans runs crossways. That is parallel with Canal, doesn't it? I've forgotten. Well, let me tell you why, and then you'll understand, because I want you to understand why I'm asking you questions. This has to do with sadomasochistic interests. It has to do with their having seen young men, including young Negro men, go into a home there, and they're hearing lots of unpleasant noises emanating from it. Do you remember anything about that? No. That sort of thing, to a degree, may figure in this, and Barbara's already asked you and gotten a name of one man, named Bruce. Oh, yeah. Who said he used to talk about it. I understand about being a sadomasochist. Now, frankly, my interest in him is what he can lead me to, not that he is a sadomasochist, which I regard as entirely his business, even though I find it unpleasant. Well, the thing about people in the quarter is that they talk a lot. That's always the problem. Whether or not the things they talked about were things they engaged in, now that's another matter. Yes, well, I understand that Judy, who was his mistress or his wife, did go around rather well bruised from time to time. She appeared to be, yes. For some reason or another, I don't. Bruce was a professional thief at the old French opera house, for purposes of identification. Professional thief? Well, I think that, or we could eliminate the professional, if you prefer. He was. This is Barbara's description. He was a waiter. Waiters in those spots, like the opera house, did engage in theft, as Bruce described it. Yes, do you remember, he was a waiter when you got there, and he was still a waiter when you left. I believe he was unemployed when I first met him. Was he employed when you left? So far as I know. Have you heard from him or of him since, or Judy? I have not. Do you remember the last name of either one? Yes, Bruce is no doubt in here. While you're looking for him, could you describe him? Well, he's a medium height, approximately my build, dark hair. When you say your build, you mean a little bit on the lean side of average. Haha. But not as tall as you. No, he wasn't as tall as I. He had dark, close-cropped hair, very nattily dressed most of the time. He took an extraordinary, for the French Quarter, that is an extraordinary interest in his appearance. What kind of clothing did he prefer? Sports dress? Yes, sports dress, but pegged trousers. He wore tight-fitting clothes. And how did he wear his hair? Close, as I recall. Short like mine, or flat top? Uh-huh. It was flat top style then. Pretty much like yours. A GI haircut? Except that his hair was quite black. Yes, how about his eyes and his complexion? He had the color of his eyes, I don't recall, but his complexion was quite white. Most of those in the Quarter, don't get any sun, yet it was not sallow. It was not unpleasant. Yes, do you know his ancestry? No, that I don't. Well, while you're looking for his name in your address book, I also understand that he and Judy had a child that they gave away rather rapidly. Oh, I don't know about that. I'll tell you that in the form of a question to see if you did, and again, I understand it was so there'd be no interference with what they regarded as their enjoyment of life. Well, that would be conceivable, yes, because they were transitory people, in a sense. How much do you think he weighed? He probably weighed 140. Suppose I turn this off while you look for the address. Well, I have it. Oh, you have it? Yes, Bruce Owen, Owen. The address is 1031 Royal? Yes, again, it was upstairs. Fine. Judy's name was Allen. Judy Allen. What age, by the way, was Bruce about? I'd say 25. And Judy? Judith, I think, I was younger than that, but it was hard to tell. She looked a bit older. Do you know where either one came from? No. I used to know where Judith came from. She told me. What does she look like? She's very extraordinary, very gaunt in appearance, very unusually thin and gaunt looking. She rarely smiles. She was not unattractive. How tall? She was a bit taller than Bruce, as I recall. That would make her probably 5'8". Is that allowing for her heels? Did she wear flat heels? To my knowledge, she never wore high heels, always low ones. Was she heavy or thin? You said she was thin. She was thin, very thin. Do you remember the color of her hair, if that means anything? Brunette. How did she wear it? Usually in disarray, just down. How did she dress, neatly or otherwise? She dressed rather unkemptly. Do you know of any employment she had? She was employed for a time, but I can't tell you where. Okay. I've forgotten now. I don't even know what type of employment it was. Well, if you think of any of these people afterwards, I'd appreciate it if you let me know. Yeah. Or how I can find them. Not because I think they've done anything wrong at all, but I think they might be able to direct me to others who I am interested in. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not. It's been so vague. First, don't apologize. I think that you know, without explaining me, that when these great events in life happen, nobody anticipates them. After they happen, the recollection of those with the clearest, most dependable recollections is inadequate, and all of the things that might relate, that we subsequently find, might relate at some time they happened. We have no reason to remember, Mr. Boatwright, so I understand this. Well, the majority of these people I found interesting, but I was not part of the in-group, so to speak. I didn't spend large quantities of time with them at one time. They were kind of characters. I don't mean in a derogatory or pejorative sense. I just mean that, well, their way of life was a good bit different. I couldn't criticize it necessarily, but I had other things to do, and I didn't spend a great deal of time. I understand that. Let's get to Thornley. Why don't you, just in your own words, tell me what you remember of him, who you knew that he associated with, regardless of the degree of intimacy of the association. Then I'll ask you more questions about it. By the way, Barbara was not clear on Thornley's status, and I want you to know what it is. He has been indicted for perjury, allegedly committed before the grand jury. Barbara would discuss this with me after she spoke to you, and I wanted to be sure that she didn't leave your a misapprehension. She has been charged with perjury, and I presume eventually there will be a trial. He's announced he'll do everything he can to avoid going back to stand trial. He's still living in Florida. Where now? Tampa. Tampa. I read in the newspaper he had been indicted. Yes, now if there's anything you knew that might be able to establish his innocence of that charge, I want you to know that I really want it very much. Because my interest is not that of a prosecutor, although I am here representing a prosecutor. My interest is that of a writer. You know that without me describing it to you, we went through with whatever it is. Well, let me tell you. No, go ahead. I will certainly be glad to tell you anything about him I know. Well, as for his guilt or innocence of the charge of perjury, that's something I wouldn't. That will come up in court. But Thornley is the one exception to what I just said a few moments ago about my relationship with the people in the quarter. I knew him better than the others. He came around, so to speak, quite a bit, especially after Barbara left around Christmas time, and I was alone in New Orleans. I would describe him as a Thomas Paine type. He was a political pamphleteer type of individual. May I ask you a question that's intended to clarify that? Are you telling me how he convinced himself, or how he conceived himself, or how you conceived him? Well, I think the two are fairly close. He never mentioned this directly. Do you know of any political tracts he wrote? No. He talked to them. Well, Let me tell you again, because my interviewing method is different than anybody else's. The only thing that I know of published that Thornley ever published is a very slight book, which is hardly a pamphlet. Besides, he is very sensitive about it. Major parts of it were contributed by other people. He fleshed it out by reprinting an edited version of his testimony before the Warren Commission. He did testify? Yes, he did, and his testimony has great significance. That's the beginning of my interest in Thornley. And his book, The Idle Warriors, has never been published, and the only writing that anybody I've ever talked to was aware of until you mentioned to me these poems, and if you know where I can get copies of them, I'd like to very much. These were in manuscript. I had night. Right. The only writing I know of him showing anybody at the Bourbon House was parts of The Idle Warriors, which he never got published at all. Some parts of it are quoted in his book Oswald. So this is why I ask you, if this guy was a political pamphleteer, I wonder if this comes from his talking or his writing. Oh, definitely from his talking. I had assumed I never saw anybody at the time of any political writing that he did. He talked a good bit. However, the ideas he had were not original. He got them out. Politically minded, but by the same token, I'm not completely naive about such matters. He was a very energetic young man, a very vital sort of guy. He was very much taken with the work of Ayn Rand, the novelist, and would quote passage and verse, chapter and verse from sections of Atlas Shrugged. It was his Bible? Pretty much so. It was an important book to him. This was something he and Brandy had in common. I had not at the time read the book. I did later and found it very interesting, but he was greatly excited by this book and by the writings of this woman. By her thought, too, I take it, yes, and he was interested in the institute that was set up. A man by the name of Brandon, in New York City, set up an institute that gave instruction in the principles of Rand. It was called the Brandon Institute or something like that. What form did his interest take, do you know? Just an expression of interest? Just a verbal expression, so far as I know. Like most everyone else in the quarter, he was a talker. However, he was a little bit more excitable and intense. Emotional, too? In a brittle sense. Yes. He did not impress as being a compassionate boy, I'm sorry to say. Yes, you think he's capable of violence, then do you pact with this emotion? That, sir, I couldn't say. Well, you never saw any sign of it. No, you never saw him in a fight or pounding the table or... No? Okay, who else did you see him with at the Bourbon House or elsewhere? The only fairly constant friend that I know of was another boy who worked at the hotels as well as the captain, I believe. His name was Vic Latham. That name is familiar to me. Yes, his address I have here too. Some of the people I wrote when I came back to Omaha, I received no reply to many of them. 937 Dumaine. Yes. When would that writing have been after the assassination? No, I think, you see, the assassination was 1963. I think that you say you came back to Omaha in January. In 1963, you came here from New Orleans. Yes. And you originate here. Yes. Any special description you can give of his relationship with Latham? Were they just friends, or Latham was a writer or wanted to be a writer? In other words, a non-published writer. Yeah, I did read some of his manuscript. It was incredibly bad. Fiction, non-fiction, or fiction. Was his thinking some of Thornley's political thinking? So far as I know, Vic had no political commitments whatsoever. Okay, who else would you say? No one else that I could say. Now, you said that after Barbara left, you saw more of Thornley. Yes. Where did you see him? He would come around to your home, to my place, the apartment there in St. Peter, or I would meet him at the Bourbon House. Yes. Everybody met everybody at the Bourbon House. I know it. And Oswald was also supposed to be there. That's interesting. And one of the people, this is Weisberg Weisberg is stating this. Oswald was supposed to have been there. And then Boatwright is saying, that's interesting. And then Weisberg says, and one of the people involved in this story, who has been very helpful, says that there was an introduction of Oswald by Thornley at the Bourbon House. Thornley says otherwise. That would have been after you left because Oswald didn't go to New Orleans where he was born. He didn't return until late April of 1963. Did you ever meet him other places than the Bourbon House, either by accident or by design? Not that I recall. We used to occasionally go over to a coffee house. Which one, Ryder or Griffin? No, I have been to Ryder, but I don't recall whether Carrie was over there, ever there or not. And then Weisberg has a note here. It says, I have no recollection ever having seen Carrie at the Ryder. Okay. Did you see the register when you were there? At Ryder's? Did you sign the guest book? I may have. I gave them a copy of my book when I was there. That was to Jack Frazier. Slim fellow, very soft-spoken, who now wears a very short beard. Trim? I don't recall the name nor the appearance of the guy. I used to do readings there. I read there several times. Did you ever meet Thornley at any of the discussion groups that used to exist in the quarter? No. Ever go to any of them? You mean political? No. Some of them were absolutely non-political. Some of them would tolerate no political discussion. All right, so here's something that's catching me as I'm going through this. So Kerry Thornley pretty much tells Garrison that he's going to the Ryder and he's going to all these coffee houses and he's going to the library and he's giving like these talks and he's speaking. And one day he's a fucking leftist, one day he's a fucking rightist. The guy doesn't know what the fuck time it is, right? So, but his best friend in fucking New Orleans at the time ends up being Philip Boatwright, who are both connected through Clint Bolton. And Philip Boatwright is going and talking at some of these gatherings and giving talks. But he's saying that he's doing it at the Ryder and some of these other places, and he's not seeing Kerry Thornley there. He's not dealing with Kerry Thornley there. So this is some weird fucking obfuscation going on here. Almost like I suspect that Kerry Thornley was doing these talks and supposed to be covert about it, and Boatwright didn't know that, so Boatwright covered up for it. But that's the impression that I'm getting right here. So let's continue. Ever go to any of them? You mean political? No. Some of them were absolutely non-political. Some of them would tolerate no political discussion. No, the only discussion type thing I ever attended there, Barbara and I both went to literary type tea in someone's home, the New Orleans Poetry Society, or someplace that was very plain, but he wasn't there. And did you ever meet Clay Shaw or any of these at any of these literary things? You know, he was a playwright, a successful one as a boy. No. Did you ever see him around? No, I don't recall him. You know what he looks like from the pictures in the paper. Again, I'll have to say I didn't. Well, let me describe him. He's a man about 6'2", tight gray curly hair, very imposing, impressive looking man, baritone voice, reputation of being a homosexual. His head now seems to jut forward on a rather thick neck. A stockily built man, wealthy man, a neat dresser. He ran the Trade Mart fairly well. He began as a publicity director for the International Trade Mart. What did he do before that? The Trade Mart opened after I left, I believe. No, the Trade Mart opened... the new Trade Mart opened after you left. Oh, there was a Trade Mart on Camp Street, I believe, on the 700 block. That's outside it's the NPW called the Gateway Building. That was a 3-story building with a curving main entrance, and that one... that was the one building Oswald picked for his rather ostentatious literature distribution and got himself arrested with several Cubans who had to come to break up his literature distribution. But Shaw's a man of culture. He's fluent in 3 languages, translates, and he's interested in plays. He wrote a successful one as a boy. I was just wondering, has he done anything else? He lives in the quarter. He's rebuilt a large part of it, rebuilt about 15 homes, and had his own created somewhat of a stir. The one in which he lives... which he put a swimming pool in it. The commission wanted to prevent that. But in his courtyard, he had a little pond. Yeah, he lives at 1313 Dauphine Street. It's a building that looks like it used to be a carriage house with the roof sloping toward Esplanade. And the entrance is that way. I have a picture and I'll show you. Well, think about any other places you may have seen Thornley or anybody you may have seen with him, regardless of how intimately. There's the French Market, isn't it? The coffee house in there. Yes, yes. And I used to go over there. Which of the two? The older one. It's called Café du Monde. Yes. Did you ever see him recognize people there or people whom you know? No, not to my knowledge. This is Mr. Shaw's house looking from Esplanade, and this is the front door. Red door, isn't it? Yes. Well, I'm afraid I haven't seen it, that I might recall if I had seen it. I don't know how long that door's been red. These pictures were taken in 1967. There's a view looking closer to the house, a view of this rather odd, again, in the general direction of Esplanade. Here's a closer view of the same thing. No, I'm afraid they don't mean anything to me. Here's a different picture. Do you recognize that? Unintelligible, apparently affirmative. You ever go there with Barbara? It's a Spanish bar. It's not Casa. Casa de la Marina is, it's not that. No, that's the only Spanish place, Casa Cuban Havana Inn. The Havana Bar. No. When Barbara first spoke to me, she mentioned Havana Bar. I wrote about it. I wrote it down. Afterwards, she said I either wrote it down wrong or she misspoke herself, and that's why I was asking while I had these pictures out. No, it was called Casa de la Marina. Yes. Wow, a pretty wild place, but it was a very interesting one. One of the places Mr. Shaw used to hang out. Oh? Yes. Oh, there were enormous quantities of people there. I'm sorry I don't have the pictures. The assistant DA who was with me when we were at Barbara's took his and mine back to New Orleans with him. I had a partial set. He had a complete set. So we'll probably be sending you copies of these pictures to see what you recognize. That would be, I think, pictures would probably stir my recollection better than anything else. Even the streets' names. I can't even in my mind now give you a good blueprint of the streets in the quarter. Do you remember a man of the description I had given you? No. Do you remember any overt homosexuals who were good-sized men? No. Did you ever hear anybody speak of, or did you meet a man using the name Bertrand? Not to my knowledge. Okay. Did he have a diversity of names? As Clay Bertrand, he would not have. Part of the record of Clay Bertrand is befriending Latin homosexuals who got in trouble with the law. Garrison says, and I agree, it's a name used by Clay Shaw, and that's why I asked. Well, to get back to Thornley and the people you saw him with, can you think of any others? No, sir, with the exception of Latham. There was a girl, but I don't remember her name. Jeannie Hack? I beg your pardon? Jeannie Hack. Her father was a professor, a medical professor. No, he lived with her for a while. This girl I met a time or two at the Bourbon House or someplace. He described her to me. That is, Carrie described it. It was kind of a temporary thing, convenience. Yes, but it was true of so many people and so many situations in the French Quarter. It was just not a... How about McAuliffe? Oh, Martin McAuliffe? Yes. Oh, yes. He's a pretty good close friend of mine. Aha! Ding, ding, ding. Okay, so now we've got Philip Boatwright, who seemingly was independently, just happened to meet Carrie Thornley, right? But then he admits here that Martin McAuliffe is a good friend of his. Martin McAuliffe was allegedly the professor at LSU who was connected to Guy Bannister, Friends of Democratic Cuba, Sergio Arcacha, and introduced Carrie Thornley by Joyce Talley, who was the typist on the Idle Warriors, right? So we are making some major fucking progress here. Boom. So now we know Philip Boatwright and Martin McAuliffe were connected. This is CIA connections here we're talking about. Oh, yes, he's a pretty good close friend of mine. Now, how about Carrie's? To my knowledge, he and Martin and Carrie did not know each other. I see. That's Weisberg saying that. But they might. And then Weisberg asks, but you don't remember seeing them together? No. Martin so seldom came to the Bourbon House. I don't think he cared too much for it. He did a lot of business at Brandon's restaurant there in the quarter, and he got political interests, As I understand, he did have some. I don't know. He had some Cuban political interests, too. Did he ever discuss these with you? No, he didn't. We didn't. Did he ever mention the Friends of Democratic Cuba to you? No. Or Radio Free Latin America? Or the Information Council of the Americas? All right, screenshotting this. Because I need to link this to Martin McAuliffe. Where's the fucking name McAuliffe in any of this? Okay, so I'm going to screenshot that. This is going to be crucial in my next... fucking whatever, connecting these dots here. So what this means is that Weisberg has already connected Martin McAuliffe to Radio Free Latin America and the Information Council of Americas, right? So this is kind of how you have to fucking learn how to digest information, right? So if Weisberg is asking in a third-party interview with a person if he knows of Martin McAuliffe, he says yes. Martin McAuliffe denies knowing about... He says he doesn't know anything about Friends of Democratic Cuba. But then Weisberg asks him about these two other organizations, and he knows this because he knows that Martin McAuliffe was directly involved with them. Okay? God, I need to make a fucking map of this so goddamn bad. There's so many of these people in New Orleans. No, the only Cuban organization that I recall was a group called the Cuban Students, something like that. Yes, this I got through Courtney. The Cuban Student Directorate? Yes, that's right. The DRE. Did any of them come into Courtney's when you were there? No. Do you know which Courtney was in touch with? Or let me simplify it. First, was he in touch with the local group, with the Miami group, or both? The Cuban Student Directorate. They call themselves the DRE. This is the only group that I knew about. Yes, they issued or printed a newsletter, as I recall, but as to Ken would say to me, for example, he'd say, our informants on the Cuban Student Directorate have given us such and such information. I want you to put this in a speech. Yes, I did radio broadcasts for him at times. Okay, I gotta talk for a minute. So I'm starting to see what's going on here. I'm starting to see the situational foundation that was going on, right? So how do I explain this? So you've got Kent Courtney, who's a propagandist. Okay. You've got Philip Boatwright and Kerry Thornley, who have worked for him at one time or another. Both of them were involved in stuffing the envelopes. Remember, Kerry Thornley talked about that in the Clay Shaw grand jury stuff. So, this is what I'm gathering. You have New Orleans. You have a large-scale operation involving propaganda and Latin America, right? Because you've got William Gaudet, based out of the Trade Mart, who's running his Latin American report, which is a fucking CIA propaganda newspaper or magazine meant to get the American people on the side of eventually fucking invading these countries, right? Pieces of shit human beings these fucking CIA guys are. So what I'm seeing is that you have this entire operation going on in New Orleans. And like I've always fucking said, even the CIA needs guys to mop the goddamn floor. Like Buell Frazier and fucking Billy Lovelady, right? So even the CIA needs guys to mop the floor, but in this case, stuff envelopes for propaganda organizations run by people like Kent Courtney. And this is what was happening. This is why all these fucking guys ended up in New Orleans. They all ended up there between other operations or things that they were doing because they just needed guys to stuff fucking envelopes. That is what the fuck all these guys were. Holy shit. To me, what this really does is put into perspective the large scale, how large scale the operation for the anti-Castro Cuban and anti-Latin American shit, mostly propaganda in the form of propaganda, was going on out of New Orleans, based out of the fucking Trade Mart, and surrounding all these guys who were ultimately connected to Clay Shaw and all this, and Jesse Core, right, and all these other guys, and Gaudet. So we're establishing the backdrop, right? We're painting the backdrop here. Coming to a fine understanding of the backdrop and how these fucking people, like this guy was from Omaha, and then he goes to New Orleans for like 6-7 months, and then he ends up going back to Omaha. Like these guys can't even fulfill a fucking year-long lease. How many times has this happened in this Kennedy assassination? These guys are like hopping around all the fucking time. It's wild shit. Wild shit. But now we know why they were going to fucking New Orleans, because they were all being used on a low level to stuff envelopes and shit for these fucking propaganda organizations. Martin McAuliffe, man, he seems to be right up in the middle of all this shit. I'm going to have to fucking... I know nothing about this guy. Martin McAuliffe seems to be a major shot caller in fucking New Orleans. The Cuban Student Directorate. Yes, they called themselves the DRE. This is the only group I knew about. Yes, they printed a newsletter, as I recall. But as to Ken would say to me, for example, he'd say, our informants on the Cuban Student Directorate have given us such and such information. I want you to put this in and say a speech. Yes, I did a radio broadcast for him at times. Yeah, so he did a radio broadcast for Kent Courtney talking about the Cubans, because this is propaganda, okay? That's what was going on in New Orleans. It was a fucking propaganda fucking factory. Damn. And all these guys just seem to like be incidentally connected because they were sent down there to do work on this propaganda operation. That's kind of what I'm gathering. You mean you wrote the broadcast that he made? Yes. You didn't make them. He did the actual broadcast. Oh, he made the broadcasts. They were taped, like this, down in the French Quarter. Oh, so he wrote the broadcasts for Kent Courtney. Like this, down in the French Quarter someplace. But as to how he communicated with these groups, I haven't the faintest idea. Did you ever see any Cubans or other Latins with him or at his places? No, but the Independent American was not an open area, you understand. The door was open. It's a home-like. It's a converted home, but the door is always locked. That's rather strange. Even when I went to work in the morning, I'd rap on the door, and one of the first secretaries would. It was always that way, as long as I was there, to my knowledge, so that no one ever came in who was not clearly associated with the newspaper or the print shop. He ran the Beauregard... I'm sorry, and that's crossed out, and then under it's written Pelican. He ran the Pelican Printing Company. So Pelican Printing Company, we can say, is probably a CIA operation. Okay. Yes, the reason I asked that is I wondered if anybody brought these releases. Not to my knowledge, and he had an enormous quantity of mail, which was... Yes, of course. Did you ever meet or hear of a man, Carlos Bringuier, Bringuier? He'd been a lawyer in Havana, but was not practicing law. He was an official of the court, and he had a general merchandise store catering to sailors on Decatur Street. Do you recall the name of the store? Casa Roca. It was near the Havana Bar and Grill in the 100 block. I know where Decatur Street is now. It's near the water. Yes, do you know where the Brad Printing Company is? That's Grad Printing Company. That's Grad. No. It was right there, just a door or two from the Havana Bar. No, I don't know. Balance, unintelligible, and then there's a bunch of scribbles. This is a strange thing. Courtney should keep his place locked up, and it indicates that he was preserving security or a concept of security for a reason. And this, of course, reminds you of a question Barbara asked you about reference to agents. Now she told me, you referred in one case to a pamphlet, Labor's International Network by Hilaire Dubarrier, that Courtney printed, and it carried the name of the Conservative Society of America, which was his. Yes. Is there anything else you can think of that would fit in with the character of keeping the place locked all the time? No, I really can't imagine any reason, because he didn't strike me as being overly suspicious in general. That is, there was no password or anything of that sort. A newspaper is a rather public building. Why keep it locked? Yes, the newspaper, as I recall, was available publicly. Even, that's why he published it. Yes, it was for sale on one of the newsstands down in the French Quarter even. You have no knowledge, however, of why he kept it locked. No, I never asked him. He had all sources of information abroad. I have no evidence that he did. Where was Dubarrier located? In Paris? No, he was sometimes in Paris. My impression was that he was a freelancer who moved around and peddled his words where he could. I don't mean by that he wasn't a legitimate writer. Kent spoke well of this man as being a Dubarrier? Yes, as being an excellent source. He traveled, as I understand it, through Europe, and to my knowledge, he had no address where he could be reached. Know of any income he had? The writer? Yes, Dubarrier. No. What did he live on, and what did he pay his expenses with? Do you know? Not a thing. What I'm really asking you is, I'll be more open about it, could he have seemingly fit the description of a man entangled in intelligence activities? Well, that's hard to say. I was trying to think whether or not there was ever any indication that Kent paid his expenses or... Yes, to my knowledge, there isn't. I wasn't thinking of Kent paying his expenses as much as others paying his expenses, and Kent being the partial beneficiary of some of his writings. It would be so expensive that otherwise Kent couldn't pay for it. It cost something to travel abroad and live. Oh, I should think so. And write the pamphlet to submit to the Independent American. That pamphlet couldn't possibly pay the expense of collecting the information in Europe, as you are well aware. I wouldn't think so. It sold for less than $1. Even if it sold for a couple of dollars, you would have to sell a fantastic number of them just to pay for this man's transportation. So this man fits the general description of one who could engage in intelligence, and that's why I'm just wondering. There are a number of such things throughout this story, and they're not as definitive as I'd like them to be, but they exist as suspicious. Let me ask you, what part could Courtney, for example, play in such a business? I have no reason to believe that he played any part, but what I am trying to do is to eliminate. If he didn't, I just told you before, you may remember, before we started taping, about finding of these leaflets that Oswald was giving out near Courtney's. Oh yes, you did mention it. I have no reason to believe Oswald and Reisman knew each other. Maybe they did, but the commission ostentatiously did not produce Reisman as a witness. And I presume that those pamphlets were planted, and Mr. Reisman or Reisman's politicians were not the kind of that Mr. Courtney would find most congenial. No, Courtney would not be regarded, at least in present-day parlance, as being a piece. That's right, or in 63. He's a rightist. No, I don't think he even then could say he was. That's right, so I don't know where these things fit, but I want to know if they do, and if they do, how. That's why I asked these things about de Barrier. Do you ever see him? No, not to my knowledge. He never visited. No one visited the Independent American. In fact, he was not on the staff to my knowledge, with the exception of Kent's brother, who did also work for him. I believe he did. Kent's brother was a lawyer, I believe. Just ran for office. Oh, he did. Didn't do very well. I was there election night. Oh, he came in to talk with Kent one day about a strike that was current there in New Orleans. I don't remember what strike it was, but I spoke with him briefly, and I had a book that was being printed at the time and needed a copyright form notarized, and I believe he handled it for me, but no one else to my knowledge outside of the mechanical staff. Now let me ask you this. It's a little bit personal. A poet is not the kind of man one ordinarily gets to go write propaganda for radio broadcasts, nor is he the kind of man who finds this kind of writing very congenial. Did Thornley ever help you with any of that? Did Thornley ever help me in the writing? Yes. No, my impression of Thornley's writing, to coin a phrase, is he couldn't help me on my worst day. I quite agree with that, but the kind of stuff that Courtney wanted of you for these broadcasts is not the kind of thing that you would ordinarily write about. No, it's true. It's more Carrie's line. You see, Barbara had a recollection of some writing connections between Thornley and Courtney. That's why I'm asking these questions. Well, I'll tell you, this may clarify that a bit. Carrie, as I recall, never spoke about this job, and the job that I had with Kent, that is, about any interest he might have had in it, but Barbara told me where she got this information. Whether Carrie told her this, or someone else, I don't know, but Carrie had apparently applied for this job. See, I got this job through an employment agency. Yes. Do you remember the name of the employment agency? Yes, it's A1. That's what Barbara seemed to remember. I think Oswald also used it, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. Well, the man, his name is, I still remember it. His name is Henry LaRoche. I don't know if he owns the company or not, but he was I think that's the name Barbara remembered. He was a very nice guy. He lives in the quarter, or did, upon Esplanade. What house number? Do you remember? No, that I couldn't tell you. I was wondering if it was close to 1313. I was never in his home. Close to 13? It was up on Esplanade. Yeah, so Carrie applied for the job and didn't get it. Yes, whether he tried, whether through A1 or he went to see Kent or what, I don't know. But you got it through A1. I got it. I got the interview, yes. Yes, but he had applied for the job and he'd been turned down, and it rankled with him. And yes, he wanted apparently very badly. I could see where he would. Politically, he was more in sympathy with Courtney. Yes, I could see that, but one thing that Kent placed as an awful lot of emphasis on was a college degree, which I had, even though it was not in political science or anything. But Thornley does not have a degree, and that may have been the difference or something else. I don't know. Kent was a strange fellow, really. He was extremely fair to me in all ways. He knew, for example, that I was a Kennedy supporter, and that's strange. And he did not, that is, I did not go around carrying a poster or anything, but then you have more of Weisberg's notes here, and it says in parentheses in handwriting, that is, I did not constantly voice my preference for John Kennedy when working with Kent, but neither was it necessary for me to deny it. Okay, so that's Boatwright's handwriting there. You didn't have to with Kent. I did not have to deny any sympathy with the then present administration. Let's get to how Thornley looked in the day you knew him, and I'm going to show you some pictures, and I'm telling you in advance why. because he dressed himself entirely differently in different periods. He was careless with his dress in regards to his cleanliness, for example. You mean just unwashed or unshaven or anything like that? Well, he never grew a beard that I knew of. Okay, so Philip Boatwright had already left New Orleans, right? So in the time he knew him, he's saying Kerry Thornley did not have a beard, right? So this is incredible information for our Kerry Thornley timeline, right? So he's saying he didn't know of him having a beard. And then he says, did he wear a stubble from time to time for 2 or 3 days? Stubble, yes. Stubble, yes, as was seen by Perry Russo at David Ferry's at the party, right? There we go. Stubble, yes, and his clothing was sometimes soiled. His hair was always meticulously combed, interestingly enough, and he could not give the one impression of being down and outer or somebody, who had just been rolling in the gutter. At that point, Barbara says he is one of the few people in the quarter who never bummed anything. He did not, but this again is part of his political philosophy. That suppose he wasn't always employed. What would he be living on? Nobody starves in the French Quarter. Yes, but nobody lives without money either. Yes, well, I understand what you mean. Bumming, it seems, is a real fine science down there. Well, I don't know how he would live, whether he comes from California, I believe, Whittier. Yes. Whether he has family that would send him money, I don't know. I never spoke with him about it. Yes, and he said he was from there because we made a joke out of it being it is Nixon's hometown. That's correct. I think he made a joke about it. Did he wear his well-combed hair short or long when you knew him? Well, medium. It wasn't short as mine is now. It wasn't as short as mine is now. Sorry about that. Crazy dogs in the background. It wasn't as short as mine is either, which is pretty short. No, he used a sort of pomade or something because it was always in a slick down. Yes. Did he ever bristle? Bristle? How do you mean? Like a short haircut? Like a short haircut standing up, but not necessarily a butch. No, I don't recall him ever having a haircut other than the one I described. Yes, but do you ever think he looked like the pictures of Oswald you saw? No, I never associated the two. Many people say they see a resemblance. Let me show you a series of pictures of him. I'll try to give you in chronological order, but you understand they may not be. Now, does that have an identification? It's from a New Orleans paper, isn't it? You see the date on it. Yes, this is from this 2-year, February 25th, this Times-Picayune, yes. From this picture, I would not recognize him. You wouldn't recognize him as the Kerry Thornley you knew? No. Let me show you another picture. Another one. This one is from the St. Petersburg Times of February 22nd of this year. Yes, that's a little bit more like him. Here he looks as though he's trying to make some point or he's listening very unwillingly to a point someone else is making. Now there's a difference in the hair in these two pictures. Yes, that's right. This hair is longer, isn't it? This hair is not quite as slicked back. He's got a little bit of a forelock. It appears that way. Yes, were his eyebrows always that dark? No, that's one of the things that causes me to wonder about both photographs for that matter. But this one is understandable because of the shadows. Yeah, the one in St. Petersburg. Yes. Did you think his eyebrows were less prominent in those days? Yes. He's fair-haired. Yes, one of these pictures gives you that impression, but his eyebrows in most pictures strike me as being rather more prominent than other pictures I've seen him in. I'll show you. Now, here is one of the things from the Washington Post of February 22nd of this year, a UPI picture. Now, that I would not have called Thornley either. I didn't tell you that was Thornley. You would. Now, there we go. There he is. That looks very much like. Now, this picture, we'll come back to this picture. This is an AP picture that is in the Times-Picayune of January 10th, 1968, and he's reading something. May I see this picture again and call something to your attention? You notice that in this picture and the other two I showed you, and this one, his hairline recedes prominently over his left temple in all 4 of these newspaper pictures. Now, I don't know if this is asking you for a very minute detail. I have this picture, which is a printed backwards, to make his hairline recede over the left temple. It did for a reason. Did this ever? No, it doesn't. Did you ever have sufficiently clear recollection to recall whether his hairline did recede in those days or in the newspaper's pictures, all of which are more recent, show a prominent recession? My impression, and this is simply my impression, I cannot remember perfectly clearly, but it is my impression that he had no noticeable recession of a hairline more than, say, you do. But now you know when it is printed that way, and that this is print and fairly prominent, and the one that you reacted to so positively is even more prominent. Yes, it is his face. It's the way, it's the way he's looking. Now, his eyebrows are less prominent in that picture, aren't they? They appear to be. But these, of course, are wire photos, and it's hard to... No, that's not... That one's not. That was made from a print. That one is a photographic one. I'm sorry, that's a wire one. It's the clearest of them all. Yes, it's a bit more clear than the others. It's also larger. But that I would call Thornley. But the recession here is not, to my view, terribly pronounced. Maybe if we had a different... Yes, an interpretation of what is pronounced. Well, maybe it's because I'm a little bit more sensitive to that because it was one of Oswald's prominent features. Now, this picture has a forelock rather than prominent in the middle. And it suggests we are again talking about the ape-pig picture. It suggests that if the hair was short, he would have had a very high brow. Well, if he did possess somewhat of a high brow, his hair was not short, though, but he combed it back, directly back, and it had a kind of, well, let's call it a pompadour. In the front, yes. It was prominent, just a little bit prominent in the front to a degree that these pictures show that. I don't know what he put in his hair, but it looks like he used some kind of fixative there that made it stay there. Did it look like grease? Yeah, well, that I can't recall. Yes, it was never out of place, so to speak, or coming down on the sides. His hair was the one part of him that was neat. Yes, it was always neat, and you've seen him with 3-day stubble, untidy clothes, unwashed. Yes, his fingernails frequently were. Isn't it that odd that he always had his hair neat? Yes, it is strange, and the nails were strange too, because he worked in a restaurant handling food, but by and large, he dressed better than the people do in the French Quarter. That doesn't make him nattily dressed, but he was dressed better than the average. Oh, I guess nattily means good dressed. And let me see, we're on page 29. All right, so we're going to call it for today, so we're going to knock out the rest of this tomorrow is what we're going to do. So this is some pretty good stuff, fascinating stuff. I hope you can see what Weisberg is getting at by talking to Philip Boatwright. He's trying to get him to acknowledge the fact that Kerry Thornley was also working with Courtney doing the propaganda stuff, because this is obviously a CIA propaganda operation. And he's always also trying to get him to acknowledge the fact that these pictures of Oswald, pictures of Kerry Thornley look like Oswald, and that's Boatwright is saying he didn't look like this when he knew him. Therefore, he drastically and intentionally changed his appearance, right? So, excellent stuff. I'm pretty stoked on this, and we're going to wrap this up tomorrow. Once again, like a broken record, if you haven't bought my book, please go buy my book. It is the foundation for everything that we talk about on this podcast. So that you can get on Amazon.com. You know the spiel. I give it every day. So please go and do some of that stuff. And we will be back tomorrow. And thanks, everybody. And I'll see you then.